In 1917, Lord Allenby conquered the Holy Land, and the Jews were promised a national home in Palestine by the Earl of Balfour, a policy endorsed by Woodrow Wilson and by the League of Nations, which made Palestine a British mandate.
San Remo, the Villa de Vachon. This is the place where legal rights were granted. This is the place where legal rights were given to both the Jewish people and the Arab people.
Dr. Jacques Gauthier is an international human rights lawyer. For more than 30 years, his focus has been the legal status of the old city of Jerusalem under international law, which was the subject of his doctoral thesis. He describes the significance of the decisions made at the San Remo conference in April 1920.
It's in this place that the leaders with the power to make binding dispositions with respect to the Ottoman territories deliberated and made the decision, having heard claims from the Zionist organization in Paris in 1919 during the Paris Peace Conference, having heard submissions from the Arab delegation in respect to what they wanted in the Ottoman territories. Having heard these submissions, a group of them gathered here and made final binding decisions in international law as to who would get what.
What mandates did, what the whole institution of mandates was about, was a way of guaranteeing self-determination of peoples. It was really the first time that international law created and recognized this right.
It was the Jewish people that were chosen to be the beneficiaries of a trust, a mandate under the care of the British government in respect to Palestine. It was the Arab inhabitants of the territories of Mesopotamia, Iraq now, Syria and Lebanon that were chosen to be the beneficiaries of a trust or a mandate. Part of it under the trusteeship of or mandate of the French, Syria and Lebanon, part of it under British supervision, Mesopotamia.
The Supreme Council of the principal Allied and Associated Powers that met here at the Villa de Vachon in April 1920 was made up of 5 nations: Great Britain, France, Italy, Japan and the United States, which as an associated power was present as an observer. The British delegation was led by Prime Minister David Lloyd George.
San Remo, from the legal point of view, is the major link between the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which was a promise, but it wasn't a legal commitment, it wasn't a legal document, it's a vital historic document. But San Remo turned it into an international commitment.
The difference is that these powers now can give rights to others. They do have the power of disposition. They receive it in treaties, such as the Treaty of Sèvres of August 1920, and later the Treaty of Lausanne of 1923. In these treaties, they are specifically granted title. So it is vital to understand that this power of disposition that was required in international law to be able to grant rights, it is obtained by these 5 powers and then conveyed subsequently to the Jewish people and to the Arabs. During the San Remo conference, as the representatives of the powers are trying to determine the scope of the territory to be covered by the mandate for Palestine, the scope of the territory to be the location of the national home of the Jewish people, the question is asked, what should Palestine be? Lord George refers to a specific map from a famous geographer, an expert in the Middle East, in Palestine. George Adam Smith refers to map 34, which is a map which depicts the kingdoms of David and Solomon, areas on the west side of the Jordan River, east side of the Jordan River. He then explains to the French representative, Millerand, that we must give the territories from Dan to Beersheba to the Jewish people if we are going to recognize properly their claim to the historical connection with the Jewish people. Also, you find a multitude of communities, of villages, of cities in the area that we would describe today as the West Bank or the disputed territories. The recognition was given that there was a connection between the Jews and these communities. It's also very interesting to note that if we look at the map, of course, at the center of it is Jerusalem.
The San Remo Resolution of April 1920 was later unanimously endorsed by all 51 countries of the League of Nations. It was a watershed moment in the history of the Jewish people, who had been exiled from their national home for almost 2,000 years. Referring to the San Remo Resolution, Chaim Weizmann, who would later become the first president of Israel, told the Zionist Annual Conference in July 1920, "That recognition of our rights in Palestine is embodied in the treaty with Turkey and has become part of international law. This is the most momentous political event in the whole history of our movement. And it is perhaps no exaggeration to say, in the whole history of our people since the exile." The Zionist Organization of America had a similar reaction.
The Zionist Organization of America similarly declared that the decision of the Supreme Council of the Principal Allied Powers, in other words, the San Remo decision, crowned the British Declaration, which is, of course, the Balfour Declaration, by enacting it as part of the law of nations of the world.
Some contend that the intent of the Balfour Declaration, the intent of the decisions of the Allies in San Remo, and then as reflected in the provisions of the Mandate for Palestine, merely meant that a national home would be established in a small component of what was Palestine. This makes no sense. When you look at the discussions between Lloyd George and the other representatives of France and Italy on April 25, and I have the minutes to support this, it's clear that the intent is to give what was on the map, discussed during the meeting, to the Jewish people for their national home.
The term national home gave rise to some confusion among various interested parties. What does national home mean? What did His Majesty's government intend by using the phrase national home? Did it intend a Jewish state? Did it intend a Jewish entity under British protection? Did it intend a Jewish cultural center in Palestine under rule by others, for example, the indigenous population? And if we look back very, very carefully at the contemporaneous records, what emerges is a very clear intent among those in the British government who were responsible for drafting what became the Balfour Declaration, a very clear intent to that at some point along the way, in the not too distant future, that a Jewish state would be the eventual outcome of the Balfour Declaration.
However, the idea that the possibility of the Jewish national home becoming a Jewish state was later denied by the British government. In the next episode of Whose Land, we look further at what the term national home really meant and at the role of Winston Churchill in the mandates.